Welcome to Investigations on Ritual Abuse, our 10th or 11th episode, depending on which one you decide to count. If you count the live stream earlier this week, what I'd say to you is it would be the 11th episode as opposed to um, the 10th episode. However, it was a special live stream in response to Justin Riggs. You can catch that on our channel at Investigations of Ritual Abuse over at YouTube. And if you want to read about investigations of ritual abuse on Substack, like the Hamblin case, the allegations against David Lee Hamblin and his cohorts in the alleged LDS Church of Satan, you can do so at the address in the lower left-hand corner of our screen. That's our Substack. And we are currently running a special for $8 a month. You get access to all three of the Substacks. That is Investigations in Ritual Abuse, Anti-Tribe, Government Sex Predators. And if you do a $50 a year subscription to one of those sites, you get access to all three of those sites. So it's a 3-for-1. You can't beat that. And so ultimately, tonight's podcast or tonight's live stream begins with the topic of why satanic ritual abuse is so difficult to prove. And I want to break this down into about 3 or 4 issues. First off, it's the delay between the abuse occurring, or when the abuse happens, and the abuse being reported. So a lot of victims of this type of abuse are abused as very young children on into their teenage years. They're not going to report because ultimately doing so would mean they get thrown into a foster care or adoptive system where, guess what? They're likely to be abused again. This is because the number one indicator, the number one predictor of childhood abuse, sexual or physical, is the presence of a non-biological parent in the home. So in the case of one of Tim Tuttle's adopted children, he sexually abused one of his adopted daughters. Tim Tuttle, of course, if you've been following my work over at Substack, over at IRA, Tim Tuttle is the brother-in-law of David Lee Hamblin. He married Hamblin's youngest sister. That would be Kristen Cree Tuttle, who is now Mayra Gray. She changed her name after a tour of Israel with her second husband, Wayne Jones Hinsey, who is now deceased, died of a heart attack in Sedona, Arizona. So ultimately, Tim Tuttle, he was a non-biological father to an adopted girl who came from, as I understand it, based on the court filings in Hamblin's case and what Kristen Tuttle disclosed in her letter of recommendation for her brother in his original criminal trial in 2013, 2014, his criminal case. It never went to trial. Ultimately, what you're looking at as a situation is basically Tim Tuttle being a non-biological parent of children, adopted and foster children who are already abused in their prior foster placements or by their biological parents. So they have been removed from their biological parents' custody, placed in foster or adoptive placements because of childhood sexual or physical abuse. And in some cases, they were born addicted to drugs because their parents were just quality individuals. And so this girl managed to report shortly after the abuse occurred to DCFS and CPS. She was interviewed by the Children's Justice Center in Provo. And Tim Tuttle was ultimately prosecuted and convicted because he admitted over the phone to a detective that he, in fact, did what he was accused of doing. And as this girl said to me in a private message, it destroyed her family. So ultimately, she as a victim looked at it as like reporting the abuse destroyed her family rather than the fact that her adoptive father, Timothy Nathan Tuttle, sexually abusing her destroyed her family. Because the truth is, a lot of victims have that misplaced blame. They have this sense that what their reporting has done is to destroy a family, to destroy lives. Ultimately, in one of the comments left on Tim Tattle's obituary, one of his other adopted daughters eulogized him, made no mention of the sexual abuse allegations against him or what he did. And according to the case files in the Tuttle case, the girl that he abused, that he was ultimately convicted of abusing, talked to one of her sisters, and her sister said, "Hey, happened to me too. I know what it feels like." And so it's yet another indicator in the Hamblin case that something is amiss, because it's not just David Lee Hamblin suffering these allegations. It is his brother-in-law, it's his patient and cousin-in-law, Sterling Van Wagenen. It's other people in his orbit. And ultimately, most of the allegations that are made of satanic ritual abuse occur years after the fact. They don't occur right after the abuse. And part of that is the fact that many of the victims feel the same way that Timothy Nathan Tuttle's adopted daughter feels or felt, is that they're going to ruin their family. Additionally, they're going to potentially break up their parents and cause divorce. And they take the blame for that, not the abuser. Not the person who raped them, not the person who sexually molested them, but they, as children, if they speak out and they say something, they're going to bear responsibility for rocking the boat or causing a problem, as opposed to the person who committed the criminal act. So, that's the first factor, is the years that elapse between the abuse and the report of the abuse, because most people don't report until well into their adulthood. The second factor is how many victims are roped into criminal activity themselves as children or as adults who have not broken away from their familial group. And what I mean by that is, if you read the Hamblin case files, if you read the victim statements, the Hamblin sisters implicate themselves in crimes ranging from child rape to murder. They point blank claim that they were enlisted by the group to murder other children and to participate in the murders of adult victims of their family's group, which called itself the group or the Church of Satan. And so ultimately, a lot of victims that I've spoken to have reservations about coming forward because they participated in homicides, they participated in rapes, they participated in an activity. Arguably, they were forced into it as children, but once they crossed the age of majority, you're looking at a situation where they're at least somewhat criminally culpable for their role in criminal activity once they're above 18. Some would say it starts at 14 or 15 or 16. Context is very important here. The age of the victim / perpetrator. That is someone who's raised in one of these groups, who's conditioned to participate in this kind of sexual sadism or these homicides. Ultimately, the context is important in terms of their age and their level of culpability, how much they willingly or willfully participated, and how much of it involves coercion or threats on the part of other people in their group. So when they disclose things to me, they're very, very cautious about what they disclose. because they could be held criminally culpable and criminally accountable for what they did. Because they're not just victims, they have crossed the threshold into becoming active perpetrators of abuse. That's another reason why it's so difficult to prove this, because a lot of people have reservations about self-reporting their roles in it. And if they do come forward and they only tell the part of the abuse that was committed by others, those others have every reason and every opportunity, if they are questioned by the police, to point the finger at their victim and say, well, they did this, this, and this. They killed people, they raped people, they participated in ritualistic ceremonies that involve criminal activity. And so consequently, the victim just doesn't want to report because they are also a perpetrator. They don't want to come forward because they suffer potential legal and civil liability, criminal liability, for their role in committing crimes. Now, were they raised to commit these crimes? Were they conditioned from almost birth to engage in homicides and rapes and other forms of depraved criminal activity? Sure, they were. But if they're over 18, there is some question as to whether or not they will be held accountable for their role in this kind of behavior. That's the reality of it. And so that's the second reason that they don't want to report. The third reason that they don't want to report is, if this happened to you, would you want to disclose it? So in the Hamblin victim statements, the girls talk about being forced to eat feces, drink urine, eat human body parts. They talk about any number of things that most people would not want the world to know that they were involved in. It's humiliating, it's embarrassing. They talk about being sexually abused in the most graphic terms imaginable. They talk about being urinated on, defecated on. They talk about any number of things that involve sexual humiliation and degradation. And so a lot of victims, if they remember the abuse against them with any clarity whatsoever, if they haven't completely dissociated, if they do remember it, if they have recovered the memories of the abuse, they don't want to face what happened to them. They certainly don't want to acknowledge it to others. I mean, would you want to disclose to people that your parents and grandparents forced you to drink urine, drink blood, eat human flesh, eat feces? No, I mean, most of us would not want to acknowledge that that happened to us for obvious reasons. It's disgusting. And so what you're looking at is a situation where the victim feels some blame. That's the first reason. The second reason is the victim is also a perpetrator of criminal activity. And the third reason is the things that happen to these people are so unquantifiably awful and disgusting and humiliating that they don't want to acknowledge it. And as a result, satanic ritual abuse becomes even more difficult to prove. The other side of it is, or the fourth area of this is, whenever ritual abuse is brought into the public eye, almost automatically there's an entire machine that has constructed a narrative around the idea of a satanic panic, and they automatically deploy their attack dogs in the media and in the community to say, hey, this is just another example of satanic panic. Ritual abuse was debunked in the 80s, and what I say to that is, no, it wasn't. What I would say to you is, what happened in the 80s is that a lot of very mentally ill people came forward. And if you had been through this, you yourself would be mentally ill if you were trying to integrate your various personalities into one personality and recover from dissociative identity disorder. Perhaps you wouldn't get all the details right yourself, but you would get enough of them right, and a lot of victims got them enough of the details right um, to be corroborative of the stories and the allegations that they were making. There was some proof. This has been proven in various court cases and in future live streams and episodes. I'll be getting into things outside of the Hamblin case, allegations outside of the Hamblin case, in which victims went to court and their allegations of ritual abuse were proven in a court of law. Does happen, it's very rare, but it is extremely difficult when you have an entire media apparatus and an entire narrative that has been mortared into the public's consciousness since the 1980s to debunk every allegation of ritual abuse as satanic panic. So you've got these four issues. You got the victim blaming themselves for what's happened, the victim fearing what might happen to their family, and looking at it as, hey, this just isn't worth the pain and the hassle. That's the first one. The second one is you have a situation where basically they're going to be pilloried in the community for being not only a victim but a perpetrator of this abuse, because many of them in their late teens and early adulthood commit crimes, and they're not just a child victim, they're an adult perpetrator, and there is some question of whether or not they will face legal repercussions for the acts that they committed as an adult. The third issue is what I said earlier. You have a situation where, is it really worth it to the victim to disclose the most humiliating and degrading experiences that they've ever had to a public that doesn't seem interested in doing anything other than reading the gory details of that abuse? Do you want to disclose the most embarrassing and heinous things that have ever been done to you? No. I don't think you do. And the fourth issue here that makes it very difficult to prove is the narrative around satanic ritual abuse, the so-called satanic panic, the so-called false memory syndrome, which is something that was created by two pederasts after their daughter accused them of molesting her as a child. And so they formed the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. You can look it up. And a lot of the people associated with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation went on to justify pedophilia, characterize it as healthy, normal, as you do. They were effectively rape and pedophilia apologists. And, of course, chief among them was someone named Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who created the concept of false memory and who testified in multiple cases, including Ted Bundy's trial, his criminal case, in which he said, effectively that the victims didn't have accurate memories, and thank God she failed to exculpate Ted Bundy, who was one of the worst serial killers this country has ever known, and who was ultimately executed by the state of Florida for the crimes that he committed in that state on the campus of the University of Florida. So you can Google Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. You can Google the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. You can Google the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and its board members and how they defended pedophilia and how they ultimately put the victims on trial. Victims who came forward and said, my parents sexually molested me. And some of those victims were in a ritual context. Some of them, the crimes against them occurred in a non-ritual context. But either way, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation existed apparently to defend those who were rightly accused of molesting children. And it existed to afford its board members, who were pedophile sympathizers, with a platform in which to advance their notion that pedophilia wasn't really harmful to children, that child rape wasn't really harmful to children. And they've been very successful in changing the cultural norms and standards around this, even now. Even in this day and age, when you hear about an educator raping one of their students, especially if it's a female educator, when you read the news coverage of it, it says that the 12, 13, 14-year-old student had a sexual relationship with their teacher. And what I would say to you is 12, 13-year-old children don't have sexual relationships with adults. They're raped. That's the appropriate term. It's not a relationship. It's a rape. Bottom line. And so when we talk about the satanic panic and the apologists, the people who have advanced that notion where SRA is concerned, they have effectively deterred a lot of SRA victims from coming forward. And as a result, we don't know the full scope of the problem. We don't know the full scope of it. A lot of SRA victims, when they see what happens to victims who do show great courage in coming forward, like Emily Sheets and like the Hamblin sisters, Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine, they decide it is not worth it to come forward and to speak truth to power and to say what happened to me as a child at the hands of a ritual abuser. And when it comes to Utah culture, these things go hand in hand, because Utah is a place where the appearance of happiness and the appearance of normalcy and the appearance of propriety, morally and otherwise, outweighs the reality. And the seedy underbelly of Utah is that Utah is home to a lot of people who are still chasing the ghost of polygamy. And what I mean by that is, over the course of my time visiting this state to investigate the Hamlin case, and over the course of my time living here, I've become aware that Utah is a state where there is a thriving swinger subculture. That is, there are a lot of married couples in Utah who engage in wife and husband swapping. And they're active Mormons. There are bishops that I've interviewed who say that a significant portion of their time ministering to their congregation is dealing with either pornography or swinging, polyamorous relationships. And this is not surprising, because in this state, a lot of men are still chasing the ghost of polygamy. They hope that it's restored. And I'm talking about men like Brian Hales and Jacob Hansen, who are two of the foremost polygamy apologists. I've had interactions with both of them online and in various forums on social media. They don't particularly like me. They usually block me after a few exchanges, because I have that effect on these kinds of people, and I'm proud of it. And so one of the things that these people do in defending polygamy is they're normalizing non-monogamy, which is the biblical standard, and they're trying to construct a historical basis for plural marriage, for non-monogamy. And the reason they're doing it isn't because they're interested in defending history or promoting an accurate version of history. The reason they say Joseph Smith started polygamy, not Brigham Young, isn't because they're concerned with who started polygamy. It's because if Joseph Smith started it, it is more plausible in their minds that it's a moral commandment that came from God. If Brigham Young did so, then, Brigham Young was possibly fabricating inspiration from God and attributing it to Joseph Smith, and that would mean that Brigham Young was a fraud, which he was. I want to state that unequivocally. What I would say to those people, both on the non-monogamy and the plural marriage side, is that it doesn't matter who started polygamy. Jacob 2 clearly classifies polygamy as whoredom. In every instance in the Old Testament where polygamy is practiced, it is an unmitigated disaster. Look at what happened to David's children. I mean, one of his sons raped his daughter. One of his other sons tried to overthrow him and died because he got caught in a tree and choked to death. If you look at what happened to Solomon, seeking after foreign wives, so on and so forth, and ultimately following after their gods in violation of a direct command of God, his decisions ultimately resulted in the splitting of the kingdom of Israel into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah, both of which were eventually conquered by outside forces, and as a result, the Israelites and the Judeans were carried off into captivity and enslaved by foreign nations because they were in violation of the covenant. And one of the things that they did that violated the covenant was polygamy. Reality is what it is. And there's no positive outcomes for plural marriage in the Old Testament. None. Anytime it's practiced, it creates more difficulties than it does solutions. And here's the thing that you notice. It's not a two-way street. There isn't a single polygamy apologist or plural marriage apologist in the LDS who believes that a woman should have multiple husbands. They recoil at that idea. Now, as time goes on, they're going to be more willing to accommodate that in the name of just getting what they want in terms of turning it into a civil rights or civil liberty or a constitutional issue. When they look at a Supreme Court decision like Obergefell, which gave us gay marriage, same-sex marriage, they look at that as like a step towards their ultimate goal of restoring polygamy as a civil liberty. That they and their wives and any other woman who's dumb enough to fall for their nonsense and think that her eternal salvation is conditioned on having a husband who has multiple wives. Ultimately, they look at gay rights as kind of a catapult for their own individual goal here. And so in Utah, the norms are that these men have a very patriarchal, and I hate that word because I am patriarchal in my outlook. I definitely believe that a man should be the head of the home. A man should be the head of the woman in marriage. But what I also believe is that a man has the duty to conform himself to the image of Christ and to love his wife and give himself for his wife after the example of Christ, who loved and gave himself for the church, who died for our sins on the cross and was resurrected, who humbled himself as God incarnate and suffered a humiliating death reserved for the worst of the worst in the Roman Empire. He was crucified, and that particular form of capital punishment was reserved for the lowest of the low. When he hung on a cross for our sins as the perfect final sacrifice, the fulfillment of the law, he ultimately did so alongside two thieves. And he did so as a perfect sinless man, as God in the flesh. And he was reduced to that level. That's how much he loved you. That's how much he loved us. And to watch polygamy apologists twist Scripture and have these pointless arguments over who started polygamy in the LDS, it's somewhat enraging to me because it is blasphemous. It doesn't matter who came up with the idea of plural marriage. in the LDS. It's whoredom either way. It doesn't matter if Joseph Smith did it. It doesn't matter if Brigham Young did it. It doesn't matter if Orson Pratt did it. It doesn't matter who did it. It's whoredom. And in Jacob 2 in the Book of Mormon, it clearly states that it's whoredom, and then it cites the example of David and Saul, and it says that just because they practice polygamy, that's not a justification for the Nephites or anybody else to practice polygamy. But the perversion of those scriptures and the absolute disregard for the plain language of Jacob 2 is part of what ties into Utah culture today. And what these individuals do not seem to understand, Jacob Hansen, Brian Hales, and others, is polygamy was ultimately a hypergamic institution when it was practiced in the LDS. When it was practiced in the church, it was a hypergamic institution in which a higher-ranking man in the priesthood could effectively shark your wife. If you were a lower-ranking man in the priesthood, he could take your wife. Now, you had to consent to it, theoretically. But what are you going to do? You're going to defy someone who's higher ranking in the priesthood than you are? And put your life or your eternal destination in the celestial kingdom at risk? No. You're going to go along to get along. And on top of it, the type of men who are into this, they enjoy things like cuckoldry anyway. They're perverts, and they enjoy the wife of their wife being with another man. They enjoy that idea. They probably have a lot of fantasies about it, and it's no wonder that Utah has a problem with pornography consumption. I mean, not free pornography. The reason we know about it is because there was a study done years ago about paid subscriptions to pornography, and Utah ranked at or near the top in regard to that. So what I would say to you is, ultimately in Utah's culture, one of the things that we keep running into is the question of whether the historical validity of polygamy, as though that's relevant. It isn't. It isn't relevant at all. What does Genesis say? A man and a woman, husband and wife, shall become one flesh. We're not Play-Doh. You don't get to mash, like when you were a little kid, you got to mash all these different colors of Play-Doh together. That's not the way marriage and relationships work. Where you as a man get to mash 3 or 4 different women into your one flesh. Monogamy has always been the standard. It's been the standard from the Garden of Eden on. It's always been the scriptural standard, even for kings, because you can read verses in Deuteronomy that say that a king shall be the husband of one wife. And none of you watching this, and none of these men in Utah who want to argue for the restoration of polygamy or the historical validity of polygamy, are kings. You're not special. You may feel that you're special. You may feel that you've had some private, personal revelation from God to you over this issue. But that private, personal revelation doesn't pass muster when it's measured against Scripture, either Jacob 2 or any number of other scriptures in the Old Testament, which clearly establish monogamy as a standard. And it doesn't pass muster when you look at the actual reality of polygamy in the Old Testament as it is practiced by King David and Solomon and others. It ends in absolute and unmitigated disaster. It ends in like marital strife or household strife between wives. It ends in children raping their siblings. It ends in children murdering their siblings. It ends in children rising up against their father in rebellion. That's David's own son tried to overthrow him. Anybody who's ever read the scriptures over the issue of polygamy comes to the understanding in the Old Testament that it's descriptive. It's telling you what happened. It's not prescribing it. It's not authorizing it. And every little out of context excerpt or selection that polygamy apologists want to cite, such as God telling David that he gave him Saul's wives, what he's referring to isn't that he gave him Saul's wives as his own wives to have sex with. He's telling David, I gave you Saul's entire household. Not just his wives, but his wealth, his position as king. And with that comes the responsibility of caring for Saul's widows, which David apparently did. And ultimately, when you're talking about that verse out of context, yes, you can fashion a justification for its supporting plural marriage or polygamy. But in context, there's no way that you can, once it's measured against the context of other scriptures and what actually happens in polygamous marriage in terms of the family dynamic and what happens to spouses, to children, to families as a whole, it's a disaster. And in the state of Utah, there's a significant portion of the male population and even part of the female population that wants to see plural marriage restored at some point in the near future. And that is why they have these irrelevant arguments over whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist or Brigham Young was a polygamist, or either or, whether or not Joseph Smith was a monogamist. And a lot of people fall into this trap of arguing over this issue when it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter who started plural marriage or polygamy. It does not matter 1 cent. It's whoredom. It's adultery. It's fornication. And ultimately, it isn't about getting to the celestial kingdom or exaltation. It's about sex. It's about a man being able to have sex with multiple women and characterize that as marriage. And there are men who think that marriage is primarily about sex, and their wives are very unhappy. Their children are miserable because marriage isn't just about sex. It's a part of it, but it's not all there is. Anybody who's ever been married who has an honest reckoning, who isn't a complete narcissist about it as a man, who isn't a self-centered jackass, they know that it's not about sex. You have to give your wife time. You have to create the conditions for sex. You can't just expect sex. Romance. And in Utah culture, one of the issues that I haven't liked since I've been here is the dynamic that I witnessed personally between men and their wives. There are a lot of men in this state who treat their wives and their daughters badly. And they don't allow them to have any feelings of their own, because if they did, those feelings and those preferences would conflict with what the man wants. And that's why this state has a problem with divorce. It's because there's only room in the relationship for one person, and that's usually the man. And as a result, Utah culture, male-centered culture, is usually about sex from the man's perspective. And the man simply expects to be sexually fulfilled and sexually gratified without ever doing anything to romance his wife or to treat his wife well. She's just supposed to give it up. And his daughter and his sons are his chattel. One of the things in the Hamblin case that's really disturbing is this idea that the father is the paterfamilias in a Church of Satan family. That's literally the title. That's verbatim what the Hamblin victim statements say. And as paterfamilias, his wife and his children are his property, to do with as he pleases. And so his wife has no agency. His children have no agency. One of the disturbing rabbit trails that I went down was talking to people in Arizona, law enforcement sources, who talked about how in a spate of sexual assault cases involving Mormon fathers and their children, their female children, their daughters, the Mormon fathers came up with the idea that the virgin birth wasn't really a virgin birth. And this directly relates to some of the apostasies that Brigham Young preached, which Brigham Young preached that Heavenly Father came down and had physical sexual intercourse with Mary. Now, if you follow that logic and you follow Mormon theology and doctrine at all, Mary is one of Heavenly Father's spirit children, who passed the veil of forgetfulness, took on a human body, or what Brigham Young called a tabernacle. And so she is effectively having sex with her own dad. And so these warped Mormon fathers down in Arizona were employing that same logic to justify having sex with their own female children, their own daughters. That was what they pointed to, was the example of Heavenly Father coming down and purportedly having physical intercourse to conceive Jesus Christ. And that's something that Brigham Young actually taught in the Journal of Discourses. You can go and read it for yourself. He actually gave a sermon on that at General Conference. Now, if that's true, Christ wasn't born of a virgin, as foretold in Isaiah 7:14, despite what some heretics want to tell you. Alma, in that context, does stand for virgin. So he's not the fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14. He's not truly the Messiah, because he's not born of a virgin. There's no sign there. It's just a normal physical birth from a physical conception. There's no sign. There's no miracle there. On top of it, he's a product of incest. Because if Brigham Young is to be believed, Heavenly Father came down and had physical intercourse with his own daughter. And so that's the cultural basis. Even though the church didn't adopt that teaching as official doctrine, even though they denounced a lot of things that Brigham Young taught, such as Adam-God doctrine, the reality of it is there are Mormon men who believe this to be true, and they use it as a justification and rationalization to rape their own children. And that culture, I have no doubt that there are some Mormon fathers in Utah who, like those Mormon fathers in Arizona, appeal to that logic to rationalize what they are doing in terms of sexually abusing and raping their own daughters. Like, I haven't encountered it in Utah, but I did speak to law enforcement in Arizona because I read about it, and I just had to chase that down because that sounds too out there to be true, and it turns out it was true. There are actual cases in Arizona where that logic was employed. These men did not deny raping their children. They did not deny raping their daughters. They justified it in a police interrogation. Like that's the reality of it. They thought that they were right because they are essentially in their homes in the place of Heavenly Father, the place of God. They are gods in their homes. And as a result, they have unfettered rationalizations or unfettered access to their children and their wives, and they get to do whatever they want sexually. And the problem is, raping your child is illegal. And of course, these people, like David Lee Hamblin, they believe they're following a, quote, higher law. Polygamy never died out in this state. It never died out in the church. It's still being practiced under different names, such as polyamory, or open marriages, or swinging. And so you see, like, when Mormon culture burst into the mainstream in this show, Mormon Wives, on Hulu, I've only ever seen the commercials. The commercials were terrible enough. And they don't have anything to do with any Mormonism I've ever been a part of. I withdrew my membership and left the church because of this kind of behavior, and the church knows that it's going on and doesn't do anything about it. That's the culture. That's the norm for this. And so what I would say to you is, ultimately in Utah, the culture does have to change if you're going to have any chance of reforming this state when it comes to sexual abuse. You're going to have to confront the history head on. You're going to have to, like, steamroll these people and say, look, we're not having this debate with you. It doesn't matter what context it takes place in. Non-monogamy is evil. Having sex with your own children is evil. Having sex with anybody other than your lawfully wedded wife in a monogamous relationship, and your wife has to be a biological female. I can't even believe we're having this discussion, but we are in this day and age because that's how far gone this civilization has become. Having sex outside of anything other than a biblical context between a man and a woman who are united together in holy matrimony, and they are both biologically male, biologically female, and they have given their lives to Christ, that's a real marriage. The man is fulfilling the role of Christ. He is leading his wife. He is protecting her and providing for her. He is giving himself for her as Christ gave himself for the church. And the wife is fulfilling the role of the church. She is honoring her husband. She is submitting herself to his headship and his authority. Because ultimately their marriage is a covenant between them. It's a covenant between the two of them and God. God is the third party in any valid marriage. And that's something that we've lost sight of. It's why more than 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce. And you think that Utah culture would be amenable to that Mormons would understand that, because they're pro-family, they're pro-traditional marriage, and what it turns out is, in reality, Mormons are swinging, Mormons are engaged in private polygamous home sealings, as outlined in the Hamblin victim statements, which, by the way, you can read at investigationsandritualabuse.com, because I've uploaded every single one of those police documents from the original investigation up to that site, so that anyone who wants to see the primary source documents that form the basis of my reporting can do so without having to file their own grammar request or go track it down. There's a lot more in there than just the original grammar release that Jenny Hatch and others obtained. There are divorce documents from some of the people involved in this, including David Lee Hamblin's own custody trial, where he was found guilty, or he was found by the court by clear and convincing evidence to have sexually abused his own daughters. There's the audio recording of David Lee Hamblin on a recorded line with his daughter while she was engaged in a pretext call before his arrest by the Provo police in 2013, in which he says, "I am sorry for raping you." And the Utah culture is, if you're on a recorded line with the police and you are saying to your daughter, "I am sorry for raping you," they still won't convict you. If a court has found by clear and convincing evidence, based on your daughter's testimony and a psychiatrist's testimony, that you did in fact sexually abuse 2 of your daughters, you're not going to be prosecuted, you're not going to be convicted, you're certainly not going to go to prison. And if another victim comes forward in 2022, Emily Sheets, and says, "Hey, while I was your neighbor in Provo, you took me down to the basement with my 2 childhood friends, Rachel and Eliza, and you gave us a lesson on how to give you a blowjob," even though it's consistent and it's corroborated by what those girls alleged in an earlier case, you're still not going to serve a day in jail. The charges will be dismissed with prejudice. The two special prosecutors will slow walk the case for almost 2.5 years. One of those prosecutors will receive a judgeship, and the case will effectively be left without an active prosecutor for almost 8 months. And the second prosecutor will have a brother who's a sex offender, and parents who did real estate transactions with an extended member of the Hamblin family. Over in Alpine, which just so happens to be named in the Hamblin victim statements as a hotbed of ritual abuse and satanic activity. That's the culture here. And what I would say to you is, when you talk about ritual abusers, I've never met one who hasn't dabbled in polygamy. I've never, in the course of investigating this, they're all engaged in non-monogamy. That is, open marriages and open relationships. They're all engaged in plural marriage sealings with each other's wives, each other's daughters, and those sealings, which take place in the privacy of homes, often involve consummation at the conclusion of the sealing. In one of the more egregious examples of this kind of behavior, the Hamblin sisters allege that their parents and others outside of their group, people involved in James Harmston's group in Manti, they obtained after-hours access to the Manti Temple, and they were able to enter the sealing rooms and seal themselves to teenage girls and rape them on the altars. So one of the things that these ritual abuse groups get off on is profaning the sacred and going into an LDS temple and engaging in this kind of depravity. And they invert the church's ordinances, its most sacred ordinances, to perpetuate sexual abuse and sexual deviancy. And it's part of the culture here. Part of the culture here is that these individuals exist in plain sight alongside faithful Latter-day Saints who are befuddled by why their bishopric and why their stake presidency and people even higher up the chain don't do anything about this. Like, that's the level at which this culture operates in this state. The number of victims I've talked to who allege ritual and non-ritual abuse, who all have a common theme in terms of like disclosures to their bishops and their stake presidents, is that they're told to forgive even though their perpetrators never asked for forgiveness, never showed any sign of contrition or remorse, never attempted to make amends or restitution for the abuse that they committed. I've heard that over and over and over again. I've interviewed 325 people in this. Just the Hamblin case. That doesn't count the people outside of the Hamblin case that I've interviewed. That's the culture. The culture is, if the victim doesn't forgive the perpetrator who has shown no contrition, no remorse, then the victim is the one who's being unchristlike. These people are raping kids. And this is the message the child victim gets when they go to their priesthood leader, is that they should forgive, and if they don't, they're the problem. In the meantime, their rapist is free to continue raping other children with impunity. He may have to go to LDS social services, but by and large, he has never reported to law enforcement. He's never held criminally or civilly accountable for what he did. And as a result, he continues doing what he does with impunity. There is no cure for pedophilia other than a bullet. There is no cure for a rapist other than a bullet. capital punishment. That's the only way to be assured that these people don't continue raping children and adults, is to kill them. Now, that should take place in the legal system. It should take place as a result of being found guilty by a jury of your peers, convicted of the crime that you were accused of committing, and ultimately, that sort of justice should be doled out by the state. It isn't being doled out by the state, and that's why I believe we're headed for vigilantism in the future, because people are increasingly tired of this. People increasingly realize they don't have to live like this. That's the reality of it. When the law doesn't work for victims and for ordinary people in society, it instead works for the very people it's supposed to punish. In Romans, it says that rulers are a terror to evil works, not to good. Well, I submit to you that we have reached a point in Utah's culture and in the world's culture at large where rulers have become a terror to good works. Try teaching your child traditional values and sending them to school and having them repeat what you teach them in the home. You'll be called a homophobe, you'll be called a transphobe, you'll be called a bigot. You'll be called every name under the sun by the school. And by the way, schools aren't your partners in educating your children anymore. They are trying to indoctrinate your children into a belief system and a value system that directly contradicts what many of you are trying to instill in your children at home. And if you have a television in your home, it's even worse, because every message that your child is getting in popular culture and entertainment is directly contradicting traditional scriptural values about monogamy, about murder, because abortion is murder, euthanasia is murder. These are the things that popular culture is trying to normalize, as homosexuality, which is called an abomination throughout Scripture. That's what's being normalized to your child every time they turn on the television and they watch a show. And that culture in Utah, you see it because here you have Charlie Bird, the former Cosmo the Cougar at BYU. He's married to another man. He's openly gay. And he and his husband hold callings in their ward. They aren't facing any kind of membership council or discipline. They aren't facing any rebuke for their sinful choices. In fact, they're free to construct an identity around that sin. In the latest guidance from Salt Lake, a transgender man is free to use a women's restroom in any meeting house, and a biological woman has to stand outside while he does so. She has to delay her relief so that he can live action role play as a woman when he is in fact a biological male, a mentally ill biological male who dresses up as a woman and live action role plays as a woman. I mean, we've all seen it. We've all seen it all over social media. We've seen these live action role playing men who enjoy invading women's spaces and who seem to get some form of sexual gratification from that invasion. We've seen them engaging in their simulated pregnancies and pretending to have periods. That sort of thing. That's the level of delusion that these people operate in. And I suspect that they aren't entirely deluded. I suspect that they fetishize pissing people off with their fact-free existence. I suspect that it's a form of antagonism on their part that is deliberate. Be that as it may, whether it's intentional or unintentional, it's just wrong. that the church in Utah is accommodating this, and the church is forcing the accommodation of it on the part of its members, not just in Utah, but throughout the world, because that is actual guidance that went out last year. That when a transgender male to female wants to use the restroom, the women's restroom in a meeting house or a stake center, someone who is like-minded in their ward or stake watches the door while they relieve themselves in a women's restroom, and biological women have to wait outside to use the restroom. That's the level of the culture, not just in Utah, but in the wider church. And that's what they're seeking to normalize. And they don't care what you think about it. They don't care what the scriptures say about it, because the scripture plainly says in Leviticus that a man shall not wear that which pertaineth to a woman. And these transgender males are wearing dresses and live-action role-playing as women. It's crossed the line from gender dysphoria into absolute provocation and antagonism. And what I would say to you is, the scriptures, which are supposed to be the foundation upon which the church rests, clearly denounce this behavior as an abomination to God. It says that the previous inhabitants of the land in Leviticus 18 practiced these abominations such as incest, child prostitution, child sacrifice, bestiality, homosexuality. Previous inhabitants of the land practiced this, and the Israelites have been set apart by God, and they should not practice these abominations, because the land spewed out the previous inhabitants as a result of their degeneracy. And what I would say to Utah is, God will not be mocked. What I would say to the church leadership, God will not be mocked. And fools make a mock at sin. Fools try to normalize sin. Fools try to construct an identity around their sin to excuse themselves from moral and cultural culpability for what they're doing. And that's exactly what's happening in the church right now. And speaking of live action role players, that brings us to our final topic of this live stream. Oklevueha Native American church leader and founder James Warren Flaming Eagle Mooney. Just the names are absolutely absurd for these people. James Warren Mooney is a white man who is live-action role-playing as a Seminole Indian. He claimed that he was actually descended from a Seminole Indian tribe, because his lineage actually ran through a Seminole Indian in his family tree. A professional genealogist was hired by the Utah County Attorney's Office when Mooney was facing criminal prosecution for drug possession and drug trafficking in the early 2000s. That genealogist found that James Warren Mooney's claims of being descended from Seminole Indians were absolute hogwash. That there was no basis for that claim. Like a lot of transgender people, James Mooney's claim of being an Indian has no basis in fact or reality. But nevertheless, for the better part of almost 30 years, James Warren Mooney has been live-action role-playing as a Native American. And the reason for him to do so is obvious. By doing so, he was able to construct a Native American church, Oklevueha, in which he was able to enrich himself. And one of the people who gave him a substantial amount of money was Ray Norda of Novell. And Ray Norda's wife was attending peyote ceremonies conducted by Mooney and his right-hand man, David Lee Hamblin. Hamblin, of course, when he was arrested for poaching deer and whatnot, Guess whose Lexus he was driving? Ray Norda's. The thing about Mooney and Hamblin, both of whom are these live-action role-playing Indians or Native Americans, is that they latch on to very prominent, wealthy people who actually have the achievements that they themselves are incapable of. They're incapable of having those achievements themselves because they lack the discipline, they lack the focus, and most of all, they lack the competence. So what they do is they create this mystical mumbo jumbo and this live action role playing nonsense where there's something other than what they are. In this case, they're both medicine men. And in Mooney's case, he at least had the sense to have vision about what Oklevueha could be. So under the guise of a church and freedom of religious expression, James Warren Mooney sought to cover for criminal activity and criminal enterprises. And what I mean by that is, in two separate raids, the sheriff's office found that Mooney possessed no fewer than 20,000 peyote buttons. The first raid turned up 12,000 peyote buttons. The second raid turned up 8,000 peyote buttons. Now, I've looked at Mooney's group at that time pretty closely. And according to people who were there, James Warren, Flaming Eagle Mooney, had at most 18 to 20 people at any one of his healing circles at a time. So clearly he did not need 20,000 peyote buttons to service Oklevueha Native American Church's membership. What Mooney had ambitions of doing was covering a drug distribution operation under the guise of religious freedom. And he was successful at that. He's been successful at that, even though he was arrested and he faced drug charges. The Utah Supreme Court conveniently stepped in and said that even non-Native Americans could use peyote in a religious setting and be protected by the First Amendment. Before that, you had to be a registered member of a federally recognized Native American tribe. So the Utah Supreme Court went one beyond that and said that even white people, live action role playing as Indians, and creating false narratives about their background and their ancestry, could use a Schedule I controlled substance in the context of a religious ceremony. And they could charge others a suggested donation of $200 to participate in these ceremonies. And so James Warren Mooney, who previously was fired as a corrections officer out of the state prison in Gunnison, who prior to that had been an alcoholic with a substantial lithium habit because he was manic depressive, James Warren Mooney became a man of means because he was able to pilfer funds from people like Ray Norda and other prominent Utahns. Ray Norda allegedly gave him $500,000, which he used to buy the home in Benjamin, Utah that he headquartered his so-called church in and lives in to this day. And so let's give you an idea of what's going on here with James Warren, Flaming Eagle Mooney. This is James and Linda Mooney. These are the people you're dealing with. And they both appear in the Hamblin victim statements as perpetrators who attended Church of Satan ceremonies with David Lee Hamblin. David Lee Hamblin was interested in combining Native American religious belief and practice with Church of Satan doctrine and practice. And as a result, according to his daughters in their victim statements, in 1999 he was kicked out of the Church of Satan. His father-in-law, Richard Lloyd Anderson, was highly upset. Um, according to the Hamblin sisters, Richard Lloyd Anderson said that David Lee Hamblin was combining or corrupting the pure doctrine of the Church of Satan, which is just basically an inversion of the LDS creation and cosmology and LDS ordinances. And so these two live-action role-playing white people managed to pass themselves off as Native Americans and Indians, and they managed to construct a very lucrative religion out of it. And they sell access to a controlled substance under the guise of religious expression and freedom to any other white person who wants to LARP and any other white person who wants to gigafry their brain. They're portraying peyote as a medicine. And so these mentally unstable people like David Lee Hamblin get a hold of this drug. And Hamlin's never stopped being a sexual predator or a deviant. Talked to multiple recent victims of his. And what I would say to you is if Hamlin's the indication of the efficacy of peyote as a drug, and if the people in his immediate circle like Eldon Talley are any indication of the efficacy of peyote, peyote clearly doesn't work on pedophiles, murderers, and deviants. Doesn't work on them at all. Doesn't heal them, doesn't restore them to productive lives lived within acceptable norms and mores. It's a way to gigafry your brain so that you can go on being even more of a deviant than you already were. And of course, people like James Warren Mooney make $200 a pop selling access to this nonsense and blowing smoke up people's asses. And it gets even better because James Warren Mooney had a franchise idea with Oklevueha. There are now Oklevueha Native American church chapters in multiple states, all of whom are pushing the issue that it's not just peyote that can be used in a religious context and enjoy First Amendment protections. It's also marijuana and ecstasy and combo and any number of other drugs. And they've actually tested the fence line and in the courts on this issue multiple times. And of course, there's the Phoenix Goddess Temple down in Phoenix, Arizona, whose founder was charged because she was practicing something called sacred prostitution. And basically, for a donation of a few $100 or so, you could go to the Phoenix Goddess Temple, and one of their priests or priestesses would give you a sexual massage, or they would have actual sex with you under the guise of releasing your traumas and your pin-up negative energies. And Phoenix Goddess Temple was under the auspices and the umbrella of Oklevueha Native American Church and James Warren Flaming Eagle Mooney. Now, ultimately, that didn't amount to anything for the founder of the Phoenix Goddess Temple because she was convicted and her organization was ultimately disbanded. They weren't allowed to practice their religious freedom in the form of sacred prostitution. That's what James Warren Mooney is enabling here. He's enabling the consumption of drugs by extremely unstable people like David Lee Hamblin and others. And he's selling access to those drugs under the guise of religious freedom or a religious ceremony or membership in a religious organization. He's a drug dealer masquerading as a cult leader. And he's a pimp. And if you read the allegations against him in the Hamblin victim statements, he was telling the Hamblin sisters that even as children, even as babies, girls attract rape. They attract their rapists. They entice their rapists because they want to be raped. They want to be sexually assaulted, and they should own their part in it. That's what was going on in these ceremonies down in Spring City and elsewhere. That's what this man is alleged to have done, and he's never done a day in jail. He did have to enter into a federal plea agreement, even though the Utah Supreme Court struck down any restriction on the use of peyote by non-Native Americans in a religious setting. He did have to enter into a plea agreement with the Department of Justice in which he agreed not to procure or disseminate or possess peyote until, of course, the federal courts had established that peyote could be possessed in that context in the exercise of religious freedom. Turns out that like 10 years before he entered into that plea agreement, there was already a case down in Texas on point with that. And, of course, the prosecutors at the federal level would have known that. And so James Warren Flaming Mooney has had unfettered access to drugs, unfettered ability. No one will prosecute him. And one of the other chilling things about the Hamblin victim statements is that these drugs were provided to children by their parents who brought them to these religious ceremonies. And so the Hamblin sisters detail, not just in their victim statements, but in DCFS reports from 1999, being forced to ingest peyote. And the court in Hamblin's custody trial outlines how Hamblin forced his daughters, one of whom was 4 years old at the time at most, she was 3 or 4, Miriam Mimi Hamblin. He forced his daughters, who were all children, to ingest peyote, which is a Schedule I controlled substance under state and federal law. And Hamblin was never prosecuted for that, and neither was his dealer, James Warren Flaming Eagle Mooney, who was the one who was procuring the peyote that Hamblin used. To this day, Hamblin is still distributing drugs to people who attend his healing circles or his ceremonies at Eldon Talley's house in American Fork. And I know this because there are people who have been in attendance at those ceremonies who have told me in explicit detail what goes on at Eldon Talley's house in American Fork. So if there are any law enforcement professionals watching this, I don't know what you're doing, but anytime you see a bunch of cars outside of Eldon Talley's house, it's a pretty good indicator that something's going on that's illicit, and they don't just use peyote, they use other drugs too. And if you were to tap Eldon Talley's phone or David Lee Hamlin's phone, you'd probably hear the details of them ordering the drugs that they procure for these ceremonies, which they sell access to. That's a rough overview of James Warren Flaming Eagle Mooney, who has allegedly participated in the rape of children, the drugging of children, and who told children that even as babies, they were enticing the men who raped them into raping them. They wanted it, and they needed to take culpability for their role in their own sexual assault, which goes back to that Utah culture we talked about earlier. James Warren Mooney started out as a Mormon. He was excommunicated, but he started out as a Mormon, and that culture is the gift that keeps on giving in terms of Utah Mormonism, in terms of California Mormonism, Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, probably Oregon and Washington too, based on what I've uncovered over the past almost 4 years. Ultimately, what you're looking at is a situation where this culture is the problem. It is the root that must be deracinated for us to make progress against the issue of ritual abuse and to unwind a lot of the damage that's being done, that continues to be done. James Warren Mooney is a liar. He's not an Indian. He's not a Native American. Neither is David Lee Hamblin. David Lee Hamblin apparently believes he's a reincarnated Indian warrior, according to his daughter's victim statements. These are white people live action role playing as Native Americans. These are white people who have no real culture of their own other than depravity. And so, out of their boredom, out of their lack of productivity, their lack of genius, their lack of originality, what do? They culturally appropriate Native American culture, and they pass themselves off as medicine men, as road men, as whatever. It's all a lie. And the problem with Utah culture is it is built on lies. It's built on lies about polygamy and plural marriage. It's built on lies about its own history. It's built on lies about its founder. And ultimately, a house built on lies cannot stand. That's my closing remark on this live stream. To recap, we covered why SRA is so difficult to prove. We covered Utah culture. And we covered James Warren Flaming Eagle Mooney. And the 4 reasons that I said that SRA was so difficult to prove is the victims have reservations about coming forward because of the damage that they think that they're going to do to their families, and the fact that they believe that they're to blame for what's going on. They believe that they're the ones who are tearing their families apart by coming forward and reporting this abuse. The second reason is that the victim is often a perpetrator of abuse themselves. That is, they have been conditioned to engage in criminal conduct, and as a result, there is some legal criminal exposure on their part, because many of them, as they cross into adulthood, have ultimately cross the bar to becoming active abusers themselves in whatever context: rape, murder, emotional or physical abuse, that sort of thing. And then when they break away from the group, they have their own crimes and their own criminal culpability to be concerned with. One of the other challenges is the distance between when a crime occurred and when it's reported, both of which tie into what I talked about earlier. That is the guilt of the victim, in the sense that they're going to do more damage than good by reporting their abuser, and also the fact that the victim is often a perpetrator themselves. The third reason is the satanic panic aspect. That is, any allegation of ritual abuse is automatically typified as like false memories or implanted memories, neither of which is recognized by the APA or the DSM. There's no scientific validity to it at all. And so, even if there were, you would still have to prove that the victim had an implanted memory or was having a false memory. And the problem is, in the case of the Hamblin sisters, there's ample corroborating evidence to substantiate what they're saying and what they're alleging against their father, including their father's recorded apology, where he explicitly says, "I am sorry for raping you." So satanic panic is one of the reasons, and the other reason is you got an entire media apparatus that's invested in discrediting this issue. And you see it every single time one of these stories comes out, one of these allegations comes out. You see the victim having to weigh the hassle and the inconvenience and the extreme odds against them in terms of securing a conviction are being believed. Look at what happened to Emily Sheets. If you're a victim, if you see what happened to her in the Hamblin case that was dismissed, you have to say to yourself, why on earth would I want to put myself through that? You see the job that the prosecutors did. They clearly weren't prosecuting the case to win it. I said on an earlier live stream this week that the real goal of the Hamblin prosecutions was to get David Levitt out of office. And they succeeded. David Levitt's political career is toast because of that news conference that he held in 2022. Like, it's over with for him. He's now in Scotland remodeling a castle called Knockderry Castle. You can Google it and find it on YouTube. And you can realize that one of the reasons David Levitt is beyond the reach of the law, of criminal prosecutors and law enforcement, is because A, he's the younger brother of a former Utah governor named Mike Levitt, and B, due to his father, Dixie Levitt, and the Levitt Group, which is one of the largest insurance brokerages in the country. David Levitt owns, I believe, a 1/6 share in it. David Levitt is worth between, as of 2008, according to his federal financial disclosures, he's worth between $31 and $81 million in 2008. Imagine what he's worth now. He's got enough of a net worth to have a huge home in Orem and also to have a giant castle in Scotland. So that's who they were targeting. They got him out of office, and that's all they wanted to do. That's why they slow-walked the case for 2.5 years, and Emily Sheets never got so much as a preliminary hearing to testify at. There's never been a ruling on the sufficiency of the evidence based on a preliminary hearing or a jury trial. They were desperate to keep that from ever getting before a jury, and they succeeded. Because if it did get before a jury, there's a chance that David Lee Hamblin would have flipped and told about other prominent Utahns who were involved in his group, either temporarily or even in an ongoing sense. Other prominent Utahns like David Levitt who allegedly participated in the rape and murder of children in a ritual abuse context. Whether it's ritual abuse or non-ritual abuse, it's irrelevant. All sexual abuse is satanic. Period. And it's all criminal. And instead of getting sidetracked by the mystical mumbo-jumbo aspect of this, you just need to zero in on the relevant part, which is these people rape kids. They murder children and adults. If Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine Hamblin are telling the truth, if Emily Sheets is telling the truth. And as such, they're just garden variety criminals. They may dress it up in Satanism. They may dress it up in Native American mumbo-jumbo religion and psychedelic drugs. But at the end of the day, they're just garden variety child rapists, deviants, and abusers. And they should be treated as such. We need to demystify these issues. And we need to just get down to brass tacks, which are these people commit crimes and they should be prosecuted and incarcerated. And ultimately, if they are raping people, they should be executed. Because that's the only cure for a rapist or a pedophile. That's the only cure for a sexual predator. I'm Goel of Investigations on Ritual Abuse, Anti-Tribe, and Government Sex Predators. The address to IRA is listed on the lower left-hand corner of the screen next to the logo. You can go there, and remember, we're running a special for an $8 a month subscription. You get access to all 3 sites. Normally that would cost you $24. We're offering you 3 sites for the price of 1 at either $8 a month or $50 annually. So I'm asking you to like and share this content and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Subscribe to us over on Rumble. You can follow me on X, where I am 1830GoL. You can also follow us on our on our page over on Facebook for Investigations of Ritual Blues. We're also on Instagram. And so any support that you can offer us in terms of sharing our content, liking it, subscribing to it is very appreciated. We are reader supported and reader funded. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next live stream. Thank you.